Let's take you live right now to the Lithuanian capital, where NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is speaking. Let's listen in.
Cover critical needs like fuel, demining equipment and medical supplies. Second, a new NATO-Ukraine Council, a forum for crisis consultations and decision-making, where we will meet as equals. And I look forward to having the inaugural meeting of the Council tomorrow with President Zelensky. Third, we reaffirmed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO and agreed to remove the requirement for a membership action plan. This would change Ukraine's membership path from a two-step process to a one-step process. We also made clear that we will issue an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO when allies agree and conditions are met. This is a strong package for Ukraine and a clear path towards its membership in NATO. Allies have also approved the most comprehensive defense plans since the end of the Cold War. These are designed to counter the two main threats we face, Russia and terrorism. Under our new plans, NATO aims to have 300,000 troops at high readiness, including substantial air and naval power. Robust deterrence and defense requires a robust industrial base. So leaders endorsed the new Defense Production Action Plan. This will accelerate joint procurement, boost interoperability, and generate investment and production capacity. To do all this, we need to invest more in defense. Our latest estimates show that defense expenditure by European allies and Canada will increase by 8.3% in 2023. This is the biggest increase in decades. Since 2014, they will have invested an extra $450 billion in defense. 11 allies now reach or exceed the 2% benchmark, and we expect this number will rise substantially next year. Today, allies made an enduring commitment to invest at least 2% of gross domestic product annually in defense, and to do more urgently to meet their commitments. NATO leaders also addressed China. China is not our adversary, and we should continue to engage. But Beijing's increasing assertiveness affects our security. China is increasingly challenging the rules-based international order, refusing to condemn Russia's war against Ukraine, threatening Taiwan, and carrying out substantial military buildup. China's nuclear modernization is unprecedented in speed and scale, and being carried out with no transparency. Allies agreed to continue working together to protect against China's coercive behavior. And tomorrow, we will meet the leaders of Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea, as well as the European Union, because we are stronger and safer when we stand together. And with that, I'm ready to take a few questions.
We'll start with Washington Post, there in the middle, yeah.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Michael Birnbaum from the Washington Post. President Zelensky, of course, issued a tweet in the middle of your talks that criticized the language that you've just agreed to on Ukraine's path toward membership. I was wondering what your thought was when you saw what he was saying about what NATO was agreeing to, and what your message would be for Ukrainians who are disappointed by this language. Thanks a lot.
What allies have agreed today is a strong, united and positive message to Ukraine about enduring support, but also a positive message on the path forward for membership. And this includes this package of practical support to enable full interoperability between Ukrainian armed forces and NATO forces, the establishment of the NATO-Ukraine Council, and then the decision to remove the requirement for a membership action plan, which actually means that instead of 2 steps to become a member, there will now be 1 step. And we also made it clear that the invitation will be issued when conditions are met. Then I would like to add that on top of that, of course, allies are also providing substantial military support, because the most urgent task now is to ensure that Ukraine prevails, because unless Ukraine prevails, there is no membership issue to be discussed at all. And therefore I welcome the military support that the allies have provided now for months, actually starting back in 2014, and then since the full-fledged invasion in February last year, substantially stepping up their support. And just over the last few days, allies have made substantial new announcements. France has announced that they will deliver long-range cruise missiles. Germany just announced a new package with air defense and armored vehicles. And the US made yet another big announcement of more military support. And many other allies have made different types of support, including the establishment of coalition to provide training for F-16 fighter jets. So put together, this is a strong message which sends a positive and united message to Kiev.
We'll go to the Ukrainian news agency in the 3rd row, yeah.
Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine here. Thank you for the floor. Question, just follow up my colleague. Can we expect today a final communiqué on Ukraine, and we can expect it tomorrow? And could you please specify what kind of conditions Ukraine still need to fulfill to initiate the accession procedure and to get an invitation? Thank you.
So we have agreed a communiqué, and we also agreed a package for Ukraine. That was agreed by the leaders, and I referred the main elements now. The practical support, the political ties with the NATO-Ukraine Council, full interoperability, the removal of the membership action plan, and then, of course, also all the different things that allies are providing bilaterally, including with the new announcements we have heard today and the last few days. I have been in close contact and regular contact, and NATO allies have also been in regular contacts with Ukrainian officials. I've discussed this also with President Zelensky, and I look forward to meet him tonight, and then also to have the inaugural meeting of the NATO Ukraine Council tomorrow, where I will set out the package of the 3 elements, bringing Ukraine closer to NATO, and this is a strong package.
Okay, Reuters. Over there. Andrew, maybe you can just ask your question.
Andrew Gray from Reuters, Secretary General. To come back to President Zelensky's remarks, he said it would be absurd if the time frame is not set neither for invitation nor for Ukraine's membership. How would you respond to that specific point, and why have allies not set out a time frame today?
What we have agreed is a very substantive package with many different elements that helps to move Ukraine closer to NATO, help them to move towards NATO membership. And this is partly a very practical support on, for instance, interoperability, and reforms, defense sector reforms and interoperability are among the conditions which are important for membership. So that's a practical way of moving Ukraine closer to NATO. Then we also send a strong political message with the language on membership, including the language which is now in the communique on invitation. There's never been a stronger message from NATO at any time, both when it comes to the political message on the path forward for membership and the concrete support from NATO allies, military support, but also the practical support on how to ensure full interoperability. And if you look at other membership processes, there have not been time lines for those processes. They are conditions-based, has always been.
Okay, we'll go to the gentleman here in the second row.
Lauri Nurmi, Iltalehti from Finland, Mr. Secretary General. The Baltic Sea becomes NATO's inland sea. NATO puts 300,000 new troops on high readiness. What does all this mean for frontline countries like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland? And what is NATO's message to Mr. Putin and Russia? How historic is this moment? Thank you.
It is historic that both Finland and Sweden will become members of NATO. Finland is already a full member, and with the agreement that President Erdogan and Prime Minister Kristersson and I were able to make last night, Sweden has also become a full member of the alliance. This is historic. It's important for the whole alliance. It's important for Finland. It's important for Sweden. But it is also in particular important for the Baltic region, because when you look at the map, you realize that, for instance, the ability to reinforce the Baltic region is very much improved by the fact that we now have Finland and soon also Sweden as full members. And that will be reflected in our defense plans, in our exercises, in our capability targets and everything else we do as an alliance. So it makes the whole alliance stronger, and it makes especially the Baltic region safer. It sends the message that NATO's door is open. It sends the message that it's for NATO allies to decide on enlargement. It's not for Moscow to deny sovereign nations the sovereign right to choose their own path. And this is, again, something we have demonstrated not only in words, but also in deeds by now allowing 2 new members and sending a message to Ukraine, which is stronger than any message NATO has ever sent before on membership for Ukraine.
We have the gentleman over there in the third row. Over there.
European Pravda, Ukraine. Secretary General, I would ask you to clarify a bit on conditions. I understand that you cannot list all of them. It's probably not clear, but maybe you see how these conditions would be defined, agreed, because I'm afraid that it would be read that NATO has lifted membership action plan, but have invented another membership action plan with another name, which is conditions. So it's like making a bit of fake achievement. Thank you.
No, what we say in the communique is that Ukraine has moved beyond the requirement for a membership action plan, just because Ukraine has come much closer to NATO. I was actually attending the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 as a Norwegian Prime Minister, and I remember very well the discussion there. And of course, the discussion now is totally different for many reasons, and not least because Ukraine is under full-fledged attack by Russia, but also because Ukraine has come so much closer to this alliance over all these years, because especially since 2014, when NATO allies start to train and equip Ukrainian armed forces, but even more so after February last year, Ukraine has demonstrated capabilities, skills, and has been more and more integrated with NATO. This is also a consequence of the equipment which NATO allies are delivering, because, for instance, when we deliver modern battle tanks or advanced air defense systems, a consequence of that is also more interoperability, more NATO standards, doctrines, and a gradual movement from the Soviet era doctrines, standards and equipment to NATO, just by the fact that so much equipment is now delivered. And of course, when we start training with training of pilots for F-16s, it will even more add to this important interoperability, which has always been a requirement for NATO membership. So this is moving Ukraine closer to NATO and to NATO membership, and also reflecting the fact that NATO has come much closer. Well, we have conditions partly in Article 10 of the Transatlantic Treaty, the Washington Treaty, and then, of course, at the end of the day, it has to be allies that assess whether conditions are fully met or not, and that's exactly what allies then have to agree, and therefore we also refer to both the conditions, but also the need for all allies to agree. That's the way we make decisions in NATO.
Politico. Politico here.
Thank you, Secretary General. Just to follow up on this important topic, I have in front of me the text from 2008 from Bucharest, which we've all been reading and rereading over the past weeks. NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. So if you were explaining just to the average citizen in the alliance and in Ukraine, people who are really keen to understand what was decided today, how would you explain the difference between the text that was agreed in Bucharest in 2008 and the specific language that was agreed today?
There are several differences. One important difference is that I think the next sentence, or at least a bit further down, we say that the next step is membership action plan. And that's exactly what we removed today. And at every summit since 2008, we have said Ukraine will become a member. The next step is membership action plan. Now we remove that. So that's actually turning this process, which has always been two steps, into one step. That actually moves Ukraine closer to membership, and it's a significant difference from the 2008 language, which has been reiterated at every summit since 2008. And it has been also a process in NATO to make that decision, because it was not a straightforward decision to make. I'm glad that allies agreed, and it was the main element in my package I launched in Oslo in May at the informal meeting. Then it was, what should I say, questions. There were questions asked whether that was to move too fast. And therefore, I'm glad that since May, since we started this discussion of removing a map requirement, all allies today have agreed to remove a map requirement. So that's difference number one. Difference number two is that we actually now have a program for how to help and support Ukraine move closer to NATO. And that is the interoperability, the multi-year program, but also the strengthening of our political ties, and also reference to that the foreign minister will also in the text we agreed today, will regularly assess progress. So this, together with the fact that the substantial delivery of equipment and training just by itself moves Ukraine closer to membership, is a big difference. There is one more difference, and that is that in 2008, Ukraine was quite far from NATO. What has happened since 2008 has already moved them much closer to us.
Swedish radio. Second row.
A strong and united message to Ukraine on support and on its membership. The words there of Jens Stoltenberg as he was addressing this NATO summit, underscoring what exactly they've agreed when it comes to Ukraine's application for membership. That's been a hot issue there at the summit, clearly evident, demonstrated by the questions that are coming up in that press conference. And our diplomatic editor, James Bays, joins us now from Vilnius. And James, as I said, it's quite clear here that the issue of Ukraine's membership has been a very big issue in this conference. It's also clear that there is not going to be a timetable for membership, right? Is that the most important takeaway on the Ukraine issue?
Yeah, Ukraine Ukraine and President Zelensky are not going to be happy with what they're hearing here. President Zelensky has already made that clear on his flight over when he heard, and I've heard so many different versions of this language, when he heard the final version that was being discussed, he tweeted, he said it was unprecedented and absurd not to set a time frame for invitation to membership and for actual membership. And that is what Secretary-General Stoltenberg has just done in that news conference. He's announced what the 31 allies have decided. Ambassadors couldn't reach an agreement on the words. In the end, it had to go to the leaders sitting around the table in a closed session to come up with the words saying that Ukraine will become a NATO member, but it says we will issue the invitation when allies agree and conditions permit. So it's very vague, and you heard in one of those questions there, how is this different from 2008, all those years ago, the Bucharest summit, when they said that that Ukraine will become a NATO member, and the Secretary General there tried to answer it. Clearly, the circumstances are very different, but in terms of what Ukraine has to do, how is it different? Well, they've dropped this thing, you heard it mentioned there, they call it the MAP, the Membership Application Plan. That is a series of hoops, targets that each country has to meet in order to reach NATO standard economically, politically and militarily. They say, well, Ukraine's at war right now, and Ukraine is working so closely with the NATO allies, they don't need to have that MAP process in place. But what's not clear, and I think this is the big question for Ukrainians, as he keeps talking about a conditions-based process, what are the conditions? What are the conditions that Ukraine must meet? And that is not being laid out by NATO allies. And that, I think, is what is frustrating Ukrainians. They want to be members of NATO as soon as possible. They've been waiting since 2008. And President Zelensky, I think, from his tweets earlier on and his comments in the last month or so, is not going to be happy with what he's been offered here. He is now in Vilnius, and he joins those 31 NATO allies for dinner tonight and then for a meeting tomorrow of something called the Ukraine NATO Council. It used to be called the Ukraine NATO Commission. It's an upgrade, not just a name change. Now Ukraine can convene meetings. And one thing significant about that, years ago, at the end of the Cold War, there was actually a Russia-NATO Council where NATO used to sit with Russia and discuss issues. Well, Russia no longer is there. That's completely moribund, and a similar body now exists for Ukraine. But that was agreed well before the summit. So I still don't think this is going to appease President Zelensky. So perhaps some tough talk over dinner.
James, I'm so glad you mentioned the issue of conditions, because it was clear during that press conference that Jens Stoltenberg was repeatedly asked by several reporters to outline what are the conditions that Ukraine has got to meet. And I think it's fair to say there wasn't really a clear answer on that. The clearest we got was referring one journalist to Article 10 of the NATO founding document, which doesn't in itself just says if any country can meet the conditions, it can apply to join. Is that a reflection of really a lack of consensus within NATO about what the conditions should be? That's why Jens Stoltenberg couldn't really explain it.
Oh, absolutely. Some of the nations in Northern Europe would like to see this speeded up very fast. Some would even like, I think, if they probably wouldn't say it publicly, but privately, would like a membership of Ukraine very, very fast indeed. But others, and most publicly, are saying it needs to be after the war ends. Some say immediately after the war ends. What some NATO nations are worried about is you get an end of a war situation, some sort of ceasefire, where Russia still occupies part of Ukraine. So there's still, even if there's a ceasefire, there's still an active conflict ongoing, and that, if Ukraine became a NATO ally, then under Article 5, which if one allied nation is attacked, then all the others have to join in and offer the necessary assistance. It's called the All for One article in NATO. Then effectively, if there was further fighting, then NATO would be dragged into a full-scale war with Russia. That's the worry of some. So difference of opinions. They have not been able to bridge the gap, I think, here. So somewhat fudge in the words, and that fudge is not going to please President Zelensky, who will be here tomorrow. In fact, we're going to see him giving a press conference after he's had his meeting with NATO with Mr. Stoltenberg tomorrow. Let's see if those differences are on display then.
All right, thanks so much. Our diplomatic editor James Bays there. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is at that NATO summit in Lithuania. Now, he's pressing for his country to have membership of the Defence Alliance, as James Bays was explaining there. So let's go live now to the Ukrainian capital and speak to our correspondent, Rob McBride. So, Rob, does it sound like, listening to that there's going to be a lot of disappointment right now in Kiev?
I think people were expecting this kind of message from Stoltenberg to begin with. He'd already telegraphed that he was going to give strong words of support for Ukraine's position, talking about strong, united, positive, but everything falling short of this actual timescale for just when Ukraine would become a full NATO member. I think there is an acceptance here in Ukraine that there is some division between NATO members, that some NATO members feel that if you do give almost an automatic guarantee of membership of NATO as soon as the fighting ends, that in some way may encourage Russia to escalate this conflict, to drag out this conflict. But then, as many people here in Ukraine would say, they've shown no sign over the past, nearly a year and a half of wanting to do any kind of de-escalation. And as Zelensky has done before now in calling for main battle tanks and then F-16 jets, and eventually getting these concessions from NATO members and the Western allies, they really would have liked to get some sort of guarantee of a concrete roadmap to NATO membership. But as we saw there, Jens Stoltenberg falling short of that, but talking about interoperability of Ukrainian forces with NATO, so paving the way for NATO membership at some point, so giving some consolations, and also reminding the Ukrainians, which they will be welcoming here, about the extra aid packages, mentioning the long-range missiles from France, the 700 million euros military aid package from Germany, all, he says, helping Ukraine prevail, because he makes the point, which is a fair point to make, that unless Ukraine does prevail, does win on the battlefield, then all this talk of NATO membership is purely academic. But again, when Zelensky, who is now in Vilnius, has been talking about saying this is absurd that they don't have this timescale, Stoltenberg really avoiding that and just going back to his position, that fairly woolly position, that all of the members have to agree at some point on the conditions, without setting out what those conditions are before that all-important invitation will be issued.
All right, thanks so much. Rob McBride there. Now, as we mentioned, Turkey has demanded concessions to back Sweden's membership of NATO. It wants Stockholm to crack down on groups it considers national security threats, including the PKK and YPG. It wants F-16 fighter jets from the US, and the Turkish government also wanted an arms embargo lifted, which Sweden immediately complied with. Well, Sweden is committed to supporting Turkey's bid to revive the process of joining the European Union. Let's go live to Dominic Kane. He joins us from Berlin. And Dominic, I'm sure you remember Germany was one of those countries, I think in 2017, where the Chancellor at the time said it wanted to end Turkey's membership talks. How is this effort now to try and reinvigorate them going down where you are?
The thing to remember, insofar as Turkey and the EU is concerned, is that it has been decades, this idea of accession. Talks about a Turkish entry into the EU have been going on since 1987. Back then it was the European Economic Community. Now it's the EU. And yet the talks, well, they have seemed to go on and then go off and then come back on again for, as I say, decades. It is also accurate to say that the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, in 2017, when she was seeking re-election, said that she wanted to end forever the idea of accession talks between Turkey and the EU. Her successor as Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has been perhaps slightly more emollient where this issue is concerned, and spoke to reporters earlier today.
At the last European Council, we decided how we want to further develop the relationship between Turkey and the European Union, and we also asked the European Commission to submit proposals and report so that we can do so. I will also talk to President Erdogan here. Turkey is an important partner for us, and this will be expressed in the future relations.
other EU heads of government, heads of state have been more unequivocal. Certainly, Xavier Bettel, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, saying pretty clearly that the EU has had problems in its relations with Turkey going back some considerable time. Now they want to try and concentrate on cooperation, not on those problems. But it's also worth making one point very clear. Just as there are conditions for a country to accede to NATO, so there are conditions for a country to accede to the EU. A market economy, humanitarian issues, the commitment to democracy and the rule of law. And there are leaders of European countries inside the EU who do have real concerns about the possibility of Ankara becoming the latest EU capital city.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Dominic Kane. Sergei Lagodinsky is a member of the European Parliament and chair of the EU-Turkey delegation. Joins us live from Strasbourg. Good to have you with us. So, has anything changed from what you can see when it relates to some of the concerns which the EU has advocated over the years about Turkey's membership? Things like the rule of law, the powers of the Turkish presidency, human rights, and so on.
From the perspective of the European Parliament, nothing changed. I am happy to hear, and we definitely welcome the membership, the upcoming membership of Sweden, and we're happy that Turkey has ceased its blockade on that. However, the path to this decision was quite puzzling to many of us, and we were concerned, and we are concerned, how much of China has been broken on the path, and the most important China, the most important capital that we have is the trust, mutual trust with allies, NATO allies, and this is something that I think Turkey and the government have damaged on the path, especially with the last proposal to link it to the Turkey's membership in the EU, which is quite surprising and quite puzzling.
Would a change in position or an increase in support of countries like Sweden, if that's the indication that they would support now Turkey's accession bid to the EU, does that change the dynamics?
To be frank, and I'm one of those in this parliament who advocate a Turkish future as EU member. There are not so many of us here in this parliament. A majority in this parliament wants to stop, not just to freeze, but to stop the accession process. I do not agree with that. However, we have substantial obstacles on our way to defreezing this process, and I don't think that there will be any new dynamics with just one of 27 countries thinking otherwise. We already had advocates in the ranks of EU members, but even one country or two countries like Cyprus, like Greece, who have substantial security concerns, they can block this process already. So I am not sure how much of an advantage and how much of a substantial progress Turkey has been able to accomplish on that front, considering what the outcome that we saw these days.
All right, if we look at things from Ankara's perspective, in 2018, Erdogan said the EU was basically wasting Ankara's time. He said concerns. He said Turks were no longer interested or losing interest in joining the EU. Should there be more concern within the EU about losing the potential partnership with an important country like Turkey?
I think we should take this seriously, and we should do our best to show that we are sincerely interested in deepening this relationship. I do think that, and I think this is the direction that will be taken by the EU. We should start showing more interest, for example, in issues like an updating of customs union with Turkey. I think there might be new dynamics regarding visa liberalization issues, something that the Turkey's government is very interested in. However, regarding opening chapters, the accession process works with chapters. These are kind of like thematic fields, packages in which EU negotiates with the candidate. So we have 16 out of 33 open chapters with Turkey, and only one has been closed. This is about science and research. It stopped, it came to a cease out of two reasons. Number one is the backsliding in Turkey regarding democracy and rule of law. We cannot seriously consider someone becoming a member who has anti-terror legislation like this, who has political prisoners, etc. And the second part is, of course, the regional policies of Turkey, also threatening members of the European Union, like Cyprus and Greece. These are two stumbling blocks, and it will be very, very difficult to move on without having worked on that.
All right, thank you for your thoughts on that, Sergei Lagandowski.